I think you're good to go.
We're good to go? Okay, wel, noswaith dda, chroeso pawb I ddigwyddiad YLAL Cymru ar fynediad atgyfiawnder a diffyg cyngor cyfreithiol yng Nghymru. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to YLAL Cymru's event this evening on access to justice and legal advice deserts here in Wales. My name is Wigley. I'll be chairing tonight's proceedings. I'm a student member of Young Legal Aid Lawyers, or YLAL, and I'm about to start the bar training course at Cardiff University in September before starting pupillage at Civitas Chambers in Cardiff in 2021. For those of you who might not be familiar with YLAL or the Young Legal Aid Lawyers, they're a group of lawyers and other practitioners who are committed to practicing in the areas of law that have been traditionally publicly funded. Our members include students, paralegals, trainee solicitors, pupil barristers, and qualified junior lawyers based throughout England and Wales. And what unites them is the belief that the provision of good quality, publicly funded legal help is essential to protecting the interests of vulnerable people in our society and upholding the rule of law. So before we begin, I'd encourage you all to sign up as members. If you haven't already, it's completely free, so don't let the cost put you off. And there's more information about them in their website, and I'm just going to copy and paste that information over to the chat, so people will have it at their fingertips should they want to use it. Now, before we move on to this timely and important discussion this evening, I'd like to introduce Emma Waddingham. Now, Legal News Wales have offered to host us this evening. Emma will be doing the facilitation of the technical points of the evening, as well as hosting our question and answers. So to introduce a bit of housekeeping to tonight's proceedings, I'll hand over to Emma.
Thanks, Crash. Hi, welcome everybody. So I'm the founder and editor of Legal News Wales. We hold a number of events, free events. We've got news, insight, analysis, interviews, events and recruitment on the website for the legal sector in Wales, and supported by a number of different organisations as well, which is fantastic. So we're delighted to host the event for YLAL. It's lovely to see you all. Just a little bit of housekeeping. So you'll find yourselves all on mute. If you could remain on mute for the duration of the talks, that would be really helpful. We're recording the session, which I'll come on to in a minute. There is a Q&A session at the end. So if you'd like to, if you feel confident enough to want to put your question forward, feel free to unmute yourself. If you've got any trouble doing that, stick your hand up. There's a reaction, little smiley face on your dashboard. You can put your hand up, obviously physically or using one of those, and your mute button will be your little microphone dash as well, dial as well, so you can use that. The Q&A will be followed by a short reading, so we'd love you to stay for that as well, which Crash and Emma from YLAL will explain about later. In terms of recording, we're simply recording it to potentially be used later. Feel free to turn your video off. It will be used either on the YLAL website, perhaps on Legal News Wales, and we may end up cropping out the Q&A, so don't let that put you off asking a question. However, if you would like to ask a question privately, there is a chat function which you'll be able to see. You can change a blue bubble from everyone to legal news, send it to me, and I'll ask it for you. It's not a problem. Just tell me which panel member it's directed to, or all of them. Without further ado, I will hand back over to Crash. There's nothing else I can think of at the moment, but if there is, I will let you know at the end of the presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Emma. I'm very grateful that we're able to have this discussion here tonight. The conversation talking about access to justice and legal advice deserts here in Wales is particularly important at the moment. We saw that the publication of the Commission on Justice in Wales report in October, laying bare the real issues around access to justice and access to advice here in Wales. And at the moment, we see COVID-19 exacerbating so many of the issues that people are facing that need legal resolution, but also making it harder for those communities in Wales to access the justice that they need in many different ways. Now, tonight we have speakers from a range of backgrounds, including the third sector, the Human Rights Commission, and legal aid laws, old and new. So we're really grateful to have some of the perspectives, to have so many different perspectives shared this evening. The first speaker who will be beginning the discussion is Angharad Price from the Equality and Human Rights Commission in Wales. Now, Angharad is an employed barrister who's been working for the EHRC and lives in Dinas Powys. She was called to the bar at Middle Temple in 2004 after working as an advocate in civil litigation and in private practice. As an employment solicitor, she's been a public sector lawyer for over 10 years with time at Caerphilly Council, Cardiff Council and the Welsh Government before moving to the Commission. In 2013, she earned merit for her LLM dissertation after writing on disability discrimination and reasonable adjustments. She gave birth to her twins, Thomas and Fionn, in November 2016, and they keep her on her toes outside of work. I'm sure it's especially challenging at the moment, Angharad. Over to you.
Hello, I think Emma's going to share my slideshow with you all now. I'm glad you mentioned my twins because you might well hear them in the background, I'm afraid. It's bedtime, so they're nearby. So it's lucky that you mentioned that to begin with. Yeah, so as Crash said, my name's Angharad Price. I'm Legal Principal Wales, and I work at the Equality and Human Rights Commission. So I am going to talk to you about what is the Equality and Human Rights Commission. I think that's on the next slide. Emma, yeah. What is the Equality and Human Rights Commission? Research we've done on lack of discrimination advice and legal aid. And then what are we doing at the Commission about advice deserts? As Crash said, you know, the Commission on Justice last October really brought into focus that advice deserts, and particularly in Wales, advice deserts is a huge problem. But it's something actually that the Commission has been working on for a really long time. And a specific part of our business plan is about increasing discrimination advice, in particular discrimination and human rights advice in Wales. And actually my own post is a new post because the Commission recognised that we needed a Welsh lawyer because of devolution. So many of the issues related to discrimination and human rights are linked to devolution, so they needed a Welsh specific lawyer, and that's why I was brought in last year to the Commission. So just a little bit about what the Commission is before I talk about everything else. I'm sure some of you have heard of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, but some of you may not have done. So these are the headline things from our spiel, which is we are a catalyst for change, enabling and encouraging improvement, bringing people together to devise solutions, building capacity in organisations to help them effect change. We are an information provider, helping people to understand their rights and improve compliance with the law, for example, guidance to public bodies. We are an influencer. We use our evidence and legal expertise to influence public policy and inform debates. We are an evaluator. We monitor effectiveness of laws and measure progress in society. And we're also an enforcer, using our strategic enforcement powers selectively to protect people against serious and systemic abuse of their rights, and to clarify equality and human rights law alongside our efforts to help organisations to comply with their equality and human rights standards. All of those things are really important, I think, in a discussion about legal aid and advice deserts, because we have for some time been trying to provide information about what there should be in terms of legal aid. We have also been trying to be a catalyst for change, and particularly using evidence to try and influence public policy. And I'm about to go through in a moment some of the research and some of the consultation responses we've done in relation to that. And more recently, we're also looking at ways we can use our unique enforcement powers in terms of supporting access to justice, which is one of our key aims in our strategic plan. You'll see on my slide there a picture of our strategic plan from 2019 to 2022. So just a bit of background though, before I move on to that. The Commission was established in 2007 as an independent organisation working across Great Britain. Great Britain, in case you're not fully aware in terms of that, means that we work in England, Scotland and Wales. So we don't, there's separate commissions in Northern Ireland, and actually in Scotland there is also a separate Human Rights Commission. So we don't work on human rights in Scotland, just equality. We promote, protect and enforce equality. We regulate the Equality Act. So that's what I was mentioning there in terms of unique powers, enforcement powers that we have to enforce the Equality Act. We promote and protect human rights, and we have a wide range of powers and duties. Okay, next slide. So the other thing I wanted to do before I move on to the more specific stuff about legal aid, this is our plan on the page for COVID-19 of things that the Commission is particularly focusing on. So my first slide, there's a picture of our strategic plan 2019 to 2022, obviously our 3-year plan, but when we individually do sort of yearly business plans behind that, that sit behind that, and this year in particular, obviously, as that was due to start on the 1st of April, we had additional COVID-19 work on that. So you'll see on that slide, I'm not going to go through all of them, but we're focusing in particular on older people in care homes, being provided with sufficient protection, particularly in terms of their human rights, and Article 2, right to life, Article 5, deprivation of liberty, and Article 8, family life. We're also looking particularly at COVID, the disproportionate impact on the BAME, Black and ethnic minority population. You've probably seen in the press, we've announced that we're undertaking an inquiry, which is one of our specific powers, where we gather basically evidence, and then we can use that if we need to enforce at a later date. Another area we're specifically, and I personally am working on, is disabled people being unable to access essential services. So in particular, supermarkets not making reasonable adjustments. And then you'll see on that slide other areas we're working on, workers facing discrimination, A-level results, exam predicted grades, human rights, obviously in general with all the restrictions, etc. of COVID, and particularly domestic violence increases, which was it was in our business plan already, but obviously has been adapted. So that's just to give you a bit of a flavour of some of the work we're doing at the moment on COVID-19 specifically. You mentioned obviously legal aid is particularly difficult, and the Commission feels a strong sense that we should be working in those areas using our unique powers where people aren't perhaps able to access advice at the moment when in the current situation. So the next slide is Wales Fairer. So as I said, we use our evidence to try and influence, and also as a basis for using our unique powers. We also have a statutory duty to publish a report every couple of years, which is to confirm the state of equality and human rights. That's actually the statutory responsibilities do one in Britain, so you've probably seen Is Britain Fairer, but we also do a specific Wales report called Is Wales Fairer, the state of equality and human rights. The last one was 2018. We're now actually looking forward, if you like, to the next one, which is going to be 2021 next year, but there is going to be a specific coronavirus report, I think, possibly towards the end of this year, but certainly there'll be a focus on it in the new Is Wales Fairer 2021. One of the reasons I want to start with here, because if you move on to the next slide, Emma. Yeah, so we particularly highlighted in terms of justice and personal security the difficulties that have been caused by the number of court and tribunal closures in Wales, and in particular that those closures have created geographical barriers, particularly for people in rural areas, but also obviously those with mobility related conditions who aren't necessarily able to access courts that are far from where they live, and reduce financial support through legal aid, and the use of tribunal fees, which obviously is now gone, but the combined reduced financial support of legal aid and those tribunal fees has created a negative effect on people's access to civil and criminal justice. And I think that's one of the focuses in terms of advice deserts here. We reported it at the previous report was 2015, and we reported it then, but we obviously reported that it hadn't improved, and in fact it worsened by 2018. Next year's report I can't say for certain, but given we've done some other research in between, which I'll come to in a moment, I suspect there will be similar findings, particularly in specific to Wales in relation to that. So if you move on to the next slide. Going back slightly, really, the first report I can find in terms of the Commission's work goes all the way back to 2003. Yeah, I have got Captain Tom on there. I know he's 100 years old, and 2003 isn't 100 years ago, but it does feel like a long time ago. Certainly for me, because I was just doing my bar course in 2003. But the research we did, Snakes and Ladder research, which is available on our website, shows advice provision in Wales is fragmented, disjointed and sparse, and highlights really the lack of advice and legal aid in Wales. And since then, the Commission has had really access to justice overall, but also specifically in our business plan each year, work that aims to increase advice in Wales. Because of that, I know we didn't call it an advice desert in that research back then, but I think it was definitely the start of us highlighting in terms of research what support is available. So if you move on. So in 2018, we actually did a specific research report looking at the impact of LASPA, the Legal Aid Sentencing and Punishment of Offenders Act 2012, which came into force in 2013. That, as you all know, I'm sure, introduced funding cuts to legal aid, resulted in people having less people being able to access legal advice and representation. And our research goes into some specific evidence about that, the difficulties people faced in accessing legal advice, and in particular, obviously, groups with protected characteristics, because that's our focus. If you move on to the next slide. Then in 2019, we published a report from an inquiry we undertook, again, using our specific inquiry powers, in which we can use, we have powers to compel evidence, we can collect evidence, and then it was published in a final report in June 2019. It was specifically about legal aid for discrimination cases, and it revealed that people are facing unnecessary barriers to justice, vulnerable individuals not being supported to bring discrimination claims specifically. One of the things we specifically raised within that report was that the mandatory telephone gateway was a specific barrier, particularly for discrimination claims. And as most of you probably know, that the government, our recommendation was to remove that for discrimination claims in particular. That I think took effect on the 15th of May in terms of discrimination claims. So hopefully we'll start to see the effect of that 15th of May this year, that is, so very recently. If you move on to the next slide. As Crash, mentioned, I couldn't talk about research into advice deserts without talking about the Commission on Justice report. We fed into the call for evidence on that. We specifically highlighted, in particular, David Lammy's report in terms of criminal justice and access to that, and the disproportionate impact on Black and ethnic minority people. And there is a specific recommendation in the Commission on Justice report on that. But I think when you look at the overall report, the statistics that the Commission highlight about legal aid, and the one I've included on my slide there about criminal legal aid, and when they've equated it down to £11.50 per head in England, and then £11.50 per head in Wales and £15 per head in England, that really does distill perhaps that there's, when you multiply that across everyone that is accessing legal aid, I think for me it really shows that there's a stark difference, and it is much harder for people in Wales to access advice in general and also legal aid. One of the other really interesting things, the Commission on Justice report is on the Welsh Government's website, but alongside that, Welsh Government undertook a rapid review of the legal sector in Wales, and that is even more stark in terms of access to legal advice, because it talks about the legal sector, lack of legal aid solicitors, particularly. I can't remember the exact numbers, but in Powys there being almost no legal aid solicitors. Many of you perhaps will correct me there, but I think it highlights, and it also highlights the demographic of single practitioners in difficult areas that may not carry on, so that the rapid review really highlights even more the difficulties in Wales, both in accessing legal advice, whereas I think the Commission on Justice report goes into far more about the advice sector in general. So I'm coming to the end of my slides, I'm sure. Next one is about our recent report. So even more recently, we published in March this year, just after everyone went into lockdown, and an interim report, and then a final report in June, only a couple of weeks ago. The reports into our inquiry into inclusive justice, a system designed for all. And that inquiry focused on disabled defendants in the criminal justice system. But actually the evidence within there is all about, we focused on a sort of people with particular disabilities in terms of mental health difficulties, learning disabilities, and how they can access using video links, which is what the interim report is about, but also how the overall criminal justice system doesn't identify their needs necessarily. They don't identify the types of adjustments they might be needed, and they don't ensure that they can fully participate in court processes and understand the charges they face. that was focused on the criminal justice system, but I think there's an awful lot in there, particularly about video hearings, given the way the Ministry of Justice has now moved to that during COVID-19. And we've seen also in more recent weeks, with the reopening of a lot of the criminal courts, that the Ministry of Justice has now undertaken a rapid process of change in all jurisdictions, not just criminal justice system. We've got strong concerns about the mental health tribunal, for example, but I think civil employment tribunals perhaps slightly less because they're more geared towards telephone and video hearings, but not for full trials, and identifying needs and adjustments being made is really key in all jurisdictions. So just highlight that report to you, that even though it is criminal justice focused, it's really good to have a look at it. Again, it's on our website, the full report's published with all the evidence behind it. If you want to move on to my next slide. And just to really highlight that one of the things in that report we make very clear is that lawyers should be looking to identify reasonable adjustments that people might need and ask for those adjustments to be made. And one of those adjustments is likely to be that you need more time with the person. And the reason I highlight it when talking about legal aid and advice desks is I know that is not an easy thing to do, and the evidence within our report may help you to argue that's something that you need. And also, obviously, come back to us if you feel someone is not getting adjustments. So if you move on to the next slide. Okay, so what are we doing about it in the Commission? I know I've probably gone over my time, so I'm going to try and just wrap up fairly quickly. But we do what we call transfer of expertise work to increase discrimination and human rights advice in Wales. So we did an event back in February. We've done an event with Legal News, actually, since lockdown. I think that was in April, can't remember exactly. And we were planning to run a number of face-to-face courses at the end of March, aimed at raising awareness of what discrimination might be for advisors, but also lawyers might find them useful. And in the future, we're planning more events along those lines, effectively training, but free training, to highlight those areas of work. We are doing policy work influencing Welsh and UK government in particular. We're doing a lot of follow-up work after that inquiry, but still work also using the early research I highlighted, and work. We just submitted a detailed response to the Senedd Committee Making Justice work inquiry, which is looking at the Commission on Justice and how Welsh Government is implementing and transforming justice as a result of it. And lastly, we're looking at developing a strategic litigation guide for lawyers to be able to use to highlight strategic litigation, how to use discrimination and human rights perhaps more in public law areas, and also what types of claims that the Commission funds, because we do fund legal work alongside using our own powers. And on that slide there, I've got resources for advisors. We have an advisors helpline, and we also have an email there, legal requests, where you can request legal funding. There's much more information on how we agree to those sorts of funding requests, and I'm more than happy to take any questions about it. I think that's my last slide. I'm sure I've gone over time. Yes, thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr.
Your timing was excellent, Angharad. Thank you so much. I think it's really useful to hear from you, especially around reasonable accommodation in the justice system at a time where we know we're going to be seeing quite rapid shift in how courts change, how they operate. And I also think, you know, the importance of equality and human rights in relation to access to justice. So before I did my legal training, I worked in policy and campaigns for Stonewall Cymru, the LGBT rights charity, and we know hate crime, housing discrimination, discrimination in services, domestic abuse, all of these are really stubborn social problems that are not showing any signs of going away. And part of the reason for that is the fact that many people are still unsure about their rights and their situations, and they lack clear and accessible routes to enforce them. So I think some really useful points there. Next, it falls on me to introduce JJ Costello from Shelter Cymru. So JJ is the head of Housing Services South for the charity, jointly responsible for its housing advice and support services. Shelter Cymru is Wales's housing and homelessness charity. I'm sure many people here will be familiar with their work, offering housing and debt advice and support, housing training, as well as undertaking policy and campaigning work with the aim of increasing housing Right, over to you, JJ.
Evening all, noswaith dda. I'm just a talking head this evening, so you don't need to look for slides anywhere on your screen. Thank you, Crash. I'm JJ Costello. I'm one of two heads of service for Shelter Cymru. It's a campaigning and advice and support delivery charity. Specifically, the advice part that I'm involved with, we run a national helpline, email advice, web chat, as well as in normal times, about 50 weekly advice surgeries in community venues, primarily offering housing advice and housing related debt advice. So Shelter Cymru's been involved in legal aid since the Green Form scheme about 1996 and currently holds housing legal contracts in each authority in Wales and the 8 housing possession court duty schemes. So we've been quite involved with legal aid. I've also recently done a year's secondment with the advice sort of planning team within Welsh Government. So I'm bringing that perspective, but anything inappropriate that I say tonight is as a representative of Shelter Cymru. So we're focusing on issues of access to justice and any options for addressing them, particularly the advice deserts and the absence of advice altogether. And hopefully I can bring a perspective from a provider, from a national social welfare provider, in terms of what is the provision, and also to highlight some of the planning and networking activity that's been happening in Wales over the last few years, which is some of the more positive side, which gives us some source of hope. So everything I say is related to social welfare provision only. That's my world and that's what I know. And by that I mean the definition that Welsh Government and the national providers use: benefits, debts, housing, employment, education, discrimination and immigration advice, although you can argue certainly that other areas fall within that category. And I think I probably want to make the point about, often there's a discussion that there's the advice sector and then there's the legal sector, as if they are two completely distinct things. And I'd certainly say in the context of social welfare law, that the dividing line is a lot less clear and wavy, and we have third sector organisations employing solicitors. And similarly, it's all rights-based work. For the individual, they're trying to enforce their rights, and whether that's a small room in a community centre in real giving benefits advice, or it's a private practice doing judicial review, it's all part of somebody's journeys to enforce their rights. So I wouldn't necessarily make that distinction between the two sectors. Giving then some perspective on provision in Wales, particularly from a viewpoint of housing advice provision, I think it's important to make the distinction between advice and assistance, so the advice advocacy in a Mackenzie Friend sort of representation, and then formal legal representation, usually under certificate, because I think the picture of provision looks very different in Wales from a social welfare perspective. In terms of advice and assistance, things are a little more positive, primarily because of the efforts of Welsh Government. Welsh Government provide a 6.6 million of funding for social welfare advice through its single advice fund, and over £1 million also for housing advice through its homelessness prevention fund. So we've got 7.6 million coming in that area, and that does mean that they grant fund provision of benefits, debt, housing advice, employment advice and some discrimination advice across Wales. Benefit, debt and housing are the areas of strongest demand, and for that reason they're also the strongest of highest provision. And arguably, because of Welsh Government's intervention, that's a stronger level of provision that we'll see in many parts of England. So that is a positive. Having said that, just because there is some baseline provision doesn't mean it's sufficient. And I'm sure the we heard from Angharad and some of the fellow speakers will highlight the availability of advice in their particular areas. For housing, that sort of level of money typically pays for 1 to 1.5 advisors per local authority area. So by itself, it's seldom sufficient to meet demand. But in the context of talking about the absence of advice, Welsh Government has made sure that there is some baseline provision in those areas. It's really in the legal representation stage of a client's journey that the situation worsens quite dramatically. And, you know, I've seen the rise in I've been involved in housing advice since the early 90s, which is nearly 30 years. So I've seen the rise and the fall of private practice provision. Back when it was in the green form days, we had every private practice firm doing a bit of housing and a few really specialising in Wales and providing some expertise. Then the Legal Aid Agency and its previous disguises moved to exclusive contracting, and then there were even more firms really developing specialisms. With LASPO in 2012 and the accompanying scope and eligibility changes, we've seen the social welfare private practice firms absolutely fall away in Wales, certainly in terms of housing advice. The recent closure of TA Law and the housing departments in Duncan Lewis, I apologise if there's any firms who say I'm obviously missing them out, but in terms of an organisation that often is looking around for extra capacity to refer certificated work to, the provision is almost at zero in Wales, and that's a dramatic decline over the last few years, and the same can be said for tribunals and benefit tribunals. And the main reason for that is income generation. Shelter Cymru employs 2 solicitors nationally that does housing certificated work. We'd employ 10 solicitors if we could generate the necessary income to cover their costs. But the scope and eligibility requirements really limit this work. And if we look at private practice and what's happened there, it's clear that the private practice solicitors have concluded the same. So on that happy note, I want to move on to some reasons to be slightly positive. And if you work in social welfare law, you need a level of optimism, and I want to give you some reasons to be optimistic. And I think there's 2. The first being the Welsh policy context, the government policy context. We saw last year the Thomas Commission recognising that the system isn't delivering for people in Wales and proposing in our area the funding for legal aid in the third sector being brought together in a single fund under the strategic direction of an independent body. This approach doesn't necessarily bring in more money, but it does make the most of the money and the provision and the resources you've got in terms of trying to match it with need and making it work together for people's sort of rounded needs. The thinking behind that proposal isn't new. Advice stakeholders in Wales have been following a similar objective for the last few years via a different route. And the milestones on that journey have been when LASPO occurred and there was a sudden reduction in legal aid funding for social welfare advice, Welsh Government undertook a advice services review in 2013. That made a number of recommendations. One of them, the Minister with responsibility for advice at the time, set up a national advice network in 2015. And I noticed that we've got the current chair, Fran Target, present with us today, which shows you that it's in tune with what's important. And that's a group of various stakeholders around advice to advise the Minister in her policy. That group developed an action plan in 2016 and a vision in 2018. It's also developed regional advice networks, which is 6 regions in Wales and advice providers coming together to both look at coordinated delivery, coordinated funding and inter-referral. And I saw also Richard Owen, who is the chair of our Western Bay Regional Advice, is also here today somewhere. So welcome to him. And really all that work that's been going on has been similar to Lord Thomas's suggestion, but via a different route, attempting to coordinate funding, so it's well used, coordinate and link delivery. It's also been about quality assuring so that the public can be confident about the advice that they're getting. And it's also been about raising awareness amongst the public of how you access the various advice agencies and opportunities out there, in terms of the profile that you have rights, and then when you have them, where can you go to find out, simply a sort of gateway to find to the advice that you need. So there's been really positive work there that's still ongoing. Like everything, it's had an interruption recently, but Lord Thomas's recommendations will no doubt add sort of fuel to the speed of change there and the direction of travel. And I suppose the second opportunity I'd like to flag is the silver lining of the current crisis is both opportunities and threats in terms of delivery. Most face-to-face provision has been suspended, certainly my organisation's had, and it's been replaced with a much greater use of remote advice. And you know, there is good within that. For some people it works really well. There's greater efficiencies, we've got greater capacity, we're helping more people. However, the downside is, you know, who isn't it working for and who is excluded? And we are learning from this, but we are anticipating an unprecedented increase in demand when the courts are operating at full volume back in September and beyond. So there is little choice but to also look to digital delivery to see how that can help us in managing those levels of demand with our current capacity. And I suppose the second aspect of the current crisis is simply that it has triggered, certainly in the area I work of housing and homelessness, it has brought almost 800 homeless people in Wales off the streets and into accommodation, and Welsh Government has made a commitment to rehouse those into settled homes. So it's brought about ways of thinking that were unimaginable before. And similarly, you know, there have been calls for a review of LASPO and legal aid, and, you know, is it fit for purpose in the face of what we are facing? So we're all watching with great interest what comes of those debates. So hopefully some small positives to offset the picture of provision in Wales. Thank you.
Thanks very much, JJ. And it's just following up on that final point. I mean, some of the achievements around homelessness policy since the start of the outbreak here in Wales have been really remarkable. And it's a real credit to the campaigners in Wales who've been working on these issues. So thank you for your work. And it's fab to have people from the third sector joining us this evening as well. I think one of the things that comes across in the Thomas Commission report is that distinctiveness of the context in Wales that has emerged, with third sector providers playing an even greater role as a sort of result of the devolution settlement. But thank you very much for that, JJ. Joining us next is going to be Hussein, who is a trainee solicitor at the Speakeasy Law Centre in Cardiff and a Justice First Fellow. He's also an accredited Level 2 Immigration and Asylum Senior Caseworker, having previously worked for Asylum Justice and Freedom from Torture. We're really pleased to have him with us today. Over to you, Hussein.
Thanks very much, Crash. I'm really pleased to be here. Thanks very much for the invite. Also don't have any slides, so you just could be looking at me. Right, so as Crash said, I'm a trainee solicitor with the Speakeasy Law Centre. We provide advice in regard to benefits, debt, housing and employment. So I'm currently doing benefits, or just started doing benefits. Majority of my experience for the last few years, about 4 years, has been in immigration. So I think a bit of a unique experience. I'm just going to quickly talk about that sort of experience in terms of personal experience, what I found it like, and what I've drawn from that, and then I'll talk about the Justice First sort of scheme, if that's right. So I think a bit of a unique experience. After university, I joined an immigration and asylum law firm, and I was doing, essentially it was mostly private and some legal aid. And then after that, I went to a charity called Asylum Justice, and that charity is based in Cardiff. And Asylum Justice is the only charity in Wales that can provide legal advice, which is OISC level 3 accredited. So essentially we're the only charity, and I think one of the only in the UK, to be able to provide legal representation for asylum seekers who are no longer eligible for legal aid. And why that's given me sort of a unique perspective on it is, firstly, when I was at Freedom from Torture, those who were no longer, if anyone doesn't know about immigration legal aid, I mean, when an asylum seeker comes to the UK, they can get legal aid quite quickly and quite easily, just a significant sort of benefit they need. After they often get refused by the Home Office, they have to get additional legal aid, or get further legal aid, and that's a bit more stringent. So the lawyer who's represented them has to find that they are 40% or above likely, I think it is, to be successful in the tribunal. So often we find a lot of law firms drop those asylum seekers and no longer represent them, because you also have a key performance indicator of a 60% success rate you have to keep. So a lot of them get dropped. But what we found, and what I found, is, number one, in Freedom from Torture in London, you found that people being dropped by the solicitors is quite quickly you were able to get them back into legal aid, essentially, because there were so many providers. Although it's not great, don't get me wrong, but in Wales, once they come to Asylum Justice, that's it, really. And we represent them, and we go to the tribunal with them, and there's no other way for them to get representation. But what we found, and I think is quite interesting, really, in terms of how legal aid works. I know there's a great report by Dr. Joe Wilding, Legal Aid, Droughts and Deserts, mostly about immigration law and about how the market works. What we found really is those asylum seekers that are dropped by their lawyers, actually there's a lot of merit in their case. Of course, they don't have the means, any of them, but there's a lot of merit in their case, and often have been dropped, a bit questionably, but not in terms of any, fashion issues, but in terms of, the pressures that legal aid puts on providers, and the difficulty to keep that going. Just in Cardiff, we've seen Duncan Lewis close, Michael McGarvey solicitors close, and Qualified Legal Solicitors, their branch in Cardiff has also closed just in the last year. So the pressure on legal aid providers is so difficult. It then falls onto Asylum Justice, and what we found again is last year, for example, our statistics were that we had a 77% success rate in the tribunal, in the first tier tribunal and the upper tribunal, and that, according to Refugee Council statistics, that's nearly double the national average. So that doesn't necessarily make sense, really. And I think the only way you can square that circle is the fact that legal aid has real systemic issues in Wales, and there's a lot of people being unrepresented, going to the tribunal on their own and being refused when they technically should be getting that representation if it wasn't for the overwhelming stress and difficulties that legal aid providers are put under in Cardiff and in wider Wales. There's no other, like I said, there's no other legal aid, or there's not many legal aid providers in Wales in general, but there's no charity, and unless it's Asylum Justice, they can give that legal representation. So in the Speakeasy Law Centre, it's similar. Working outside of legal aid, again, working with people who are unable to get legal aid. We don't have a legal aid contract, so working with people who can't get legal aid, who may via merits or just not be eligible, and we're working in benefits and debt and housing and employment. But especially with benefits, you've seen a complete drop off of the amount of providers, as the other speakers have spoken about before. So I think it's an interesting perspective in the sense, working outside of it while before working within it. It just shows really the glaring sort of issues that come with legal aid and how the advice is formed, essentially. So moving on about my own experience with the Justice First Fellowship. When I first obviously did a law degree. I did it because I wanted to do social welfare law, social justice law, and that's the reason why I did it. I don't necessarily have an interest in the wider sort of just legal sort of things. It's just because I wanted to try and do something with you know what the law can do. And you know, it's difficult for me at first to find the sort of training contracts that are available for someone who wants to do it and doesn't want to really relocate to London, and if they do, it has to do unpaid internships, etc. So like, this is why it took a bit of time, and I took two to 3 years of doing, you know, accrediting myself, doing accreditations and doing that sort of work until I felt comfortable then doing the LPC. But that's where the Justice First Fellowship really comes in, because it's a great initiative where it actually has a list of, you know, it basically compiles all these social welfare and social justice law firms that are able to give you a training contract, to give you that supervision, and to bring you in actually to a cohort of people who have the same sort of views. Because of course, you know, in this area of law, you're not necessarily going to get too much really money, and you know, it's quite difficult because it's a niche area of law to find these opportunities. So you're really with people, like-minded people, who are all trying to do the same sort of thing. So you know, as you know, with this difficult sort of COVID situation, that's something that I've just found quite helpful, that you have people who, a lot of support from the Justice First Fellowship in general, and a lot of people going through the same sort of circumstances in different law centres. So that you know, that I find quite really great as an initiative, and the reason why I really went for it, and part of the reason I actually went for it as well is the ability to do a project. And I think this is really a great part of the initiative, where you can, as a trainee, you're able to basically say you're going to basically put a project forward that would increase the expertise within a specific area of social welfare law. And I think that's because, as we've seen, and as the speakers have already amazingly said, you know, there's a real issue with provision, and people within the Justice First Fellowship in years gone by have done really amazing projects that have actually created lasting change. And I think that's really important. Just my own colleagues, because the Speakeasy have managed to get quite a few Justice First Fellowships, really great. My colleagues, for example, my two colleagues, the first is doing one on backdating benefits for refugees, which is an incredibly important project, because a lot of refugees don't know that when they're an asylum seeker, they can then backdate their benefit claims to what they could have claimed for specific benefits like child benefit, and then in some cases tax credits. So that's really important, because, you know, essentially people could earn thousands, really, especially when we do asylum claims. Some asylum claims I've done have ran for about 2 years. So, you know, it's an incredibly important project. And then you've got my other colleague who's doing one on PIP claims and assessments, and the issues that come around physical and mental disability, and how they're assessed, and how sort of sometimes they can be done in a way that can be sort of problematic, and the issues that come with that. And again, that's, you know, a super important project, because it's something that shines a light on an issue that hasn't really been, you know, hasn't really had as much attention as some would say it deserves. And I think that's really important about these projects. You can go into do areas which technically a lot of people haven't really thought about. My own project is one which relates, I worked with the Trans Equality Legal Initiative, TELI, for the past year, or that past 2 years, I think. And my, you know, building on that is something I'm really interested in, and really want to try and do my best with, in terms of advocating for trans rights through the law. My own project is running a trans advice legal clinic in the law centre, I should say. And I think that would be the first such clinic in Wales, really. And I don't know many. I know there's Pink Law in the University of Queen Mary's University, but that's something that I think would be really beneficial, something that I want to be led by the trans community and trans people, and also, of course, involve, you know, cis people, you know, non-trans people as well, but, you know, really have that as something that is led by trans people. And you know, I just facilitate and it comes to what the Angharad spoke about with the European, with the Equality and Human Rights Commission, in the sense of discrimination law, and that's something, you know, we'll really be trying to concentrate on, and it'd be interesting to get her sort of feedback on that, because we'll also be producing a leaflet. It's obviously slowed because of COVID, but we're producing a leaflet for trans people, talking about the rights they have, because, you know, it's disproportionate levels of you know, social inequality when it comes to trans people. And you see the state at the moment with Boris Johnson completely pushing away any reform to the Gender Recognition Act. A lot of trans people are homeless and have difficult, you know, are difficult to access the internet, etc. And there's a lot of discrimination, etc., that comes with people putting false information. So we have a leaflet that people can be given that would set out in plain English their rights and the law, and one to give to employers as well, which set out what they should be doing at the very least to protect trans rights within their workplaces. And that's what my project is. And I'm hoping, you know, to get that started as soon as possible in terms of the legal clinic. And yeah, so just to finish, so I think, yeah, you know, Young Legal Aid Lawyers and, you know, the Justice First Fellowship are both really important sort of initiatives that allow people who are like-minded, who want to work in social justice areas of the law, to come together, collaborate, create projects, understand the way it's working, and really build the next generation, because, you know, they're trying to dwindle it as best they can, aren't they? So it's really important to galvanize that. And that's all I'd like to say. Thanks again for having me. And but yeah, that's all.
Thank you so much, Hussein. It's been really great to have you speak with us this evening. Some really important work, some really interesting projects. I think we've got Joe Wilding in the audience, so I'm sure they'll be very pleased to see their report cited, and just really highlights the kind of star-studded audience we've got tonight. So looking forward to the discussion, and as a reminder, if you have any questions that you'd like to submit, you can do that through the chat function, and if you want to send them directly to Emma, who will be facilitating the Q&A section, just click that box where it says everybody to change it to Legal News Host. Now, our final speakers this evening are a duo of Annie Bannister and Sue James. So starting with Annie, following a successful career in marketing, Annie completed her academic training to become a solicitor. Since 2018, she's worked as an inception caseworker at a personal injury law firm where the majority of her cases are people in prison. She has a particular interest in modern slavery, having worked with the European Anti-Trafficking Network, RENATE, since 2012, where she sits on their legal task group, and more recently working at Hope for Justice, supporting their advocacy and policy team. She's joined by Sue James, who is the director and solicitor at Hammersmith and Fulham Law Centre and a specialist in inheritance law. In 2017, she won the Legal Aid Lawyer of the Year Outstanding Achievement Award. She's a founding trustee at Ealing Law Centre, which opened in 2013, and has worked in law centres for most of her career. She's a member of the campaigning group Justice Alliance and is a regular speaker on legal aid and access to justice. She writes a regular column for Legal Action magazine and regular articles for other journals, and is co-editor of the Legal Aid Handbook 2021. Now, together they'll be speaking to you about the North Wales Law Centre project. So to introduce that project, I think I'm going to hand over to Annie first. And I look forward to hearing from both of them. Over to you, Annie.
That's great. Thank you very much, and hello everybody. I'm just going to switch over and share my screen. Okay. Being very slow now. Okay. So, first of all, to introduce our three of us that are actually on this call. So Sue and myself have been introduced, but also there's another member, which is Ruth Parker, that you'll see she's in the audience as well. We've been looking at the possibility of a law centre in North Wales over the last few months, as we've just started to see, you know, how much of an advice and legal desert it is in North Wales in particular. So, what's the first thing that people look for when they're looking for legal help? Well, they hopefully want to have it free. And there is a legal aid system that, as we've all heard today, it's pretty poor, particularly in North Wales. We've done some research, and as we're sort of looking at this project, we've identified 23 firms of solicitors with legal aid contracts in North Wales. If we look at since 2013, there has been a consistent fall each year in the number of legal aid contracts and firms that are offering it. It's dropped much more in Wales, 29%, rather than in England, it's 20%. And why? We've all heard because of LASPO. There's lots of areas of law now that just don't qualify for legal aid, as well as the very, very low income somebody has to have in order to qualify for it. So why a law centre? We've all heard of law centres. There's 47 of them across England and Wales currently. Law centres have been around for quite some time, and they are seen as a specialist area of advice and legal casework and litigation. So JJ was talking a little bit earlier how he feels it's a complete desert, really, in terms of the litigation and legal casework support. There's a little bit more advice out there. Now, what a law centre brings is it brings these three areas together. So it's able to look at legal advice, legal casework and litigation. You'll see on the screen there that there are already a number of places in North Wales that do offer legal advice, such as Systems Advice, obviously Shelter we've heard from today, but also Bangor University are trying to open a legal advice centre as well. There's pro bono opportunities for solicitors that are in North Wales, and there's also opportunities for partnership work. And then very importantly for law centres is to work with local communities in terms of campaigning for better rights. And so really these sort of three different areas of law, the law centre is already set up as a structure, as an entity to be able to actually deliver these services, which is why we're considering looking at it in North Wales. But why North Wales in particular? Well, this map hopefully shows very clearly why. So the poorest regions in the UK are those in the sort of dark burnt orange. And you can see circled there in the North Wales area is one of those very, very poorest regions in the UK. And this is on an EU scale. Then we look at on the right-hand side, the map of the law centre network of the 47 that are currently open in the UK. And again, you can see what an advice desert and a legal desert it is in North Wales. We've got a lovely cluster there in London, and Sue actually works across two different law centres in London, which she can mention later. But because it's got such a strong structure of delivering legal advice, legal casework and legal litigation, we are hoping that we're going to be able to open a North Wales Law Centre sometime in 2021. Now, Jo's going to be hopefully very happy that she's been mentioned for a second time here, because, you know, what legal matters are we going to be able to offer from the Law Centre? Well, we haven't reached that point yet. We are investigating all. But the really, really critical point here is our aim is to try and work in partnership with the organisations that already exist and are all working hard in this sector. What we definitely don't want to do is to suddenly, you know, start to try and work in competition with anybody. And so really our next stage of work is to try and make connections with these partners and try and find ways that we can both work well together. So this map on here, which has got some very interesting Welsh counties on, which are not the current counties, but they do appear in Joe Wilding's report, where it's showing there, everything that's showing in the sort of grey colour means there's no legal aid contract at all for asylum work. And so you can see in North Wales, there is one in Wrexham actually, but Wrexham is so near the English border that we're looking more along more towards the west side of North Wales to try and get all those rural communities and those coastal communities sort of connected through this. And then another huge indicator of the desert of North Wales is this rise and rise of litigants in person. And we've seen, there's quite an old chart on the left-hand side, but that's showing that, you know, after the implementation of LASPO, that the rise in litigants in persons in Wales was 76%. And that's not halted. It grows every year. If you look at the chart on the right-hand side, particularly in the area of family law, that people are going, and many people are unrepresented now. The volunteers at the Personal Support Unit have helped 65,000 over the last year, whereas 6 years ago it was only 10,000. And these are people who've gone to represent themselves in court. So just to confirm and before I hand over to Sue, is, you know, we are hoping from speaking to everyone tonight that we're going to be able to start to develop partnerships with other organisations in North Wales to see if we can find, we can be the glue that fits us all together and gives us a bigger legal provision for those that need it in North Wales. And so if I can now hand over to Sue James, please.
Thanks, Annie. Are you going to share, are you going to move your screen or just carry on? You're muted. So thanks, everyone. I think we've heard loads tonight about need, and so I don't think we need to deal with that. I am very conscious that I am sitting here in London and talking about advice needs in Wales. But the idea is to assist with the project and then that to be a local initiative. And certainly Ruth and Annie are on board with that. The starting point of being a law centre is that as a law centre, we can tap into the whole network, which is hugely supportive. It's a national representative network of great law centres, 47 now, there used to be 41. So I'm really pleased. I'm really pleased that Speakeasy last year converted from being an advice agency to a law centre. You know, so as we develop law centres, I think, you know, we can see the value that they actually get. We do want to deliver unmet legal need and not replace anything that's currently ongoing. And I think that's the kind of starting premise. So we do have some challenges, which I'll deal with, but first steps. And so this is a really, really tiny initial project of an idea that I've been thinking about for some time because I have connections in Wales. And at the conference, Reblaw, I got to meet Annie and Ruth, and for the first time, I thought there is a possibility that something might happen because it has to happen on the ground. And so I'm hugely excited. I have got experience of setting up law centres. I set up one 7 years ago in Ealing, and I've pretty much worked in law centres. So I am kind of addicted, but I promise I'm only helping, and then we'll move away. But we do, you know, what we've done initially is come together for a couple of meetings, and then I've explored the possibility of some seed funding, which is going to provide basically setting out the scoping of a business plan and a feasibility study. And so that's why it's, you know, it's really exciting to be able to talk tonight, and hopefully then to share partnerships and people can talk to us, because what we want is a representative steering group that then converts to a trustee board that then runs the Law Centre. So we've got seed funding from Law Centre Network and from Legal Education Foundation. We've got the brilliant Matt Howgate providing specialist support to see, you know, to develop the business plan and the feasibility study. So the next stage will be contacting organisations, kind of looking at legal need, looking at the gaps. And as Annie said, we haven't worked out what we actually need to do yet, because that's going to be fed by the information that we get. So so first of all, we're going to create the business plan, budget, costings for the centre, a fundraising strategy, making the charity an incorporated organisation, securing sufficient funding, and then compliance, communication. Challenges that we've got, huge challenges. I mean, just even thinking about where it might be as a physical location is just like huge. And as Annie said, you know, there is a need in Wrexham, but it's so close to England that we think it needs to be the other end of North Wales. Delivery of services in rural and remote locations is a challenge, and obviously I'm used to dealing with things in London, and what works in London isn't going to work the same as in Wales, and so those are challenges that we have to overcome. And I really do believe that the legal aid agency needs to be disbanded and it needs to be localised, and what the needs are in Wales are different to the needs in London, and I have been working on separately around those kind of things. So abolish the legal aid agency first of all. Then we've got to ensure that the services are dual language. That's going to be really important for the development of the centre. Recruitment of staff. And I know that in the past there has been attempts, you know, money was found for an employment lawyer in North Wales, but recruitment was a real problem. And I think we need to kind of address that, because what we want are local people working locally, and how do we attract them? So kind of ideas around that. You know, we might need to use sabbatical positions for the centre to get going, but then you know, we really want to grow our own, and certainly Annie and Ruth are coming up to being the stage where they could be trainee solicitors. And you know, we've heard from Hussein about the Justice First Fellow, and that will be something that we're certainly looking at. But strong trustee board is key at this development stage, and so we are really interested in people being involved in that. So come and talk to us, I think, and yeah, we're happy to share and collaborate, and that's what we want to do, because we think there is a need for it. I think all of you lot have seen that there's a really need for it, and it needs to happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sue and Annie, both of you, and Ruth as well, everyone who's been involved. I think it's a real testament to the power of networking, given your stories so far. So it's brilliant to have you here in a room of 60 people across Wales. I can already see the chat buzzing with offers of collaboration, and I think it's also really exciting to hear the issues around access to justice in the Welsh language are already a part of your thinking, because that's such an important issue no matter where you are in Wales, but especially in our Welsh-speaking heartlands. So thank you very much to all our speakers. It's now time to move on to the Q&A part of the evening. So soon I'll be handing over to Emma from Legal News. But before I do, there's just one thing I'd like to remind people, that we'll be concluding, as has become a custom at YLAL meetings, with a recital of Sian Pierce, who's one of our members' poems. So that'll be a real treat. I'm saying it to make sure that people don't dash off at the end of Q&A thinking that everything is done and dusted with, because you'll miss what will be a real highlight of tonight's session. So having said my piece, I'll now hand back over to Emma, who will be facilitating your questions for our panel.
Absolutely, thank you. A fantastic array from the speakers as well. Really appreciate it, and thank you for your time in staying on for a bit of a Q&A session. I've just we do have some questions that have come in from the chat. I just want to offer the floor to anyone that had a burning question now, to either unmute yourself and chip in. If not, no, that's fine. So a couple of them here, I'll do them in perhaps a little bit of an order. One perhaps affects you know, how the sector is funded in terms of legal aid, and one is how it's applied, so from the profession. This may be a question that could dictate an entire series in itself, but if there's perhaps a point from each of the panelist members to make, what could and should we do differently if legal aid was devolved to Wales? Have the panelists got perhaps at least one point that they'd like to raise as a potential idea? Thanks.
I'll go first if you want. Obviously for us, there's a big concern about discrimination in human rights law, but also public law. And I think there's been a recent report, I think Sarah Nason might be on here, recent report about public law as well. And so for me, Welsh Government already, with the advice network, which has been mentioned, have looked to kind of plug some of the gaps where legal aid has been reduced. But those areas, you know, public law, discrimination and human rights law would be my sort of one of our policy asks for Welsh Government to look at funding legal advice in that area if it was devolved.
Thank you. Any other panel members have a wish list?
I would say that investment in the development of lawyers. There used to be a scheme that the Legal Services Commission did where they would pay for trainee solicitors. And I think we need to grow our own in different parts of the country in order to respond to local need.
Really valid point. Thank you. Any other panelists? Thanks, JJ.
I think the rates of payment clearly need to go up, and I guess within that something has to give, and it may be we help less people, but we produce sustainable services that are actually there rather than the ones that aren't there at the minute, because it isn't economic to deliver legal aid services. So there's that issue. There's obviously scope and eligibility, bringing more people in, but there's only so much money. So I suppose there's also considering how we can reduce the court costs in the area I'm involved with, housing. There's thoughts around like a housing tribunal that's more accessible for people, quicker hearings, less need for representation, you know, lower cost application fees. So there's issues around that. There's also, Shelter Cymru put out a report last week around the absence of litigation in Wales, and there's actually issues of local authorities not having the funds to fund litigation. So where they're challenged, they're backing down on individual cases, but it's never developing any body of case law or best practice that sort of develops the law. So, you know, on all sides, you need to fund and support the legal system.
Thank you.
So I'd just like to say that particularly in Wales and in North Wales we've been looking at is the need for outreach. It's so much more difficult for people that need legal help to actually make their way to a location, and it's finding a way that perhaps we can have some financial support to take the legal help out in an outreach environment.
Thank you. Any other points from the panelists? It's interesting, isn't it, that technology is something that comes up time and time again in terms of access to justice, but you know, whether that would help with an outreach, perhaps not, because it's the fact that you need to go and see people and that face-to-face element as well. And I think if something that COVID has taught us is that there will always be restrictions in terms of giving sustainable and high-quality legal advice with purely just the use of technology. So while it's a lovely thing to think that we might be able to utilise, it's not the be-all and end-all. so I've got another question here, and again, it might be that there's just kind of like a 1 point from a couple of people would be fantastic. What can we do to encourage Welsh lawyers to practice in Wales? And I suppose specifically in terms of legal aid and public law perhaps as well. Does anybody have a couple of ideas, or again a wish list on that, or something that they've seen has worked that might be applicable? So obviously trying to retain our talent is incredibly important and an increasing challenge at the moment.
Yeah, obviously one of the recommendations of the Commission on Justice we haven't really talked about tonight is the Law Council for Wales, which brings together universities in terms of training. You know, Sue mentioned sort of growing your own, but obviously it starts really in universities in Wales. You know, as I said at the beginning, my post in the Commission was where they recognised that with devolution there's a real need for Welsh legal expertise, and I don't think lawyers necessarily trained outside of Wales will necessarily have that in every area. Some areas, but a lot of the areas we talked about tonight, you know, housing in particular, there's devolved issues now, public law more and more and more. And one of the points for us, particularly at the Commission, is that we're looking at lots of issues around public sector equality duty. And you mentioned there not being challenges in Wales. Since the beginning of this crisis, there's been 60 judicial reviews, potential judicial reviews in England, and not one in Wales yet. So that really shows how stark things are in that regard. You know, there are more promising things as well, because Welsh Government are enacting the socioeconomic duty. So I would hope when they're considering higher education, who are also bound by those duties, you know, there would be a sort of start in terms of growing our own Welsh lawyers, and then helping them look for opportunities in those areas. I think there's Hugh Pritchard is on the call from Cardiff University. I'm sure he would have views on that, but that would be my views on it.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I think an increase in, similar to what Angharad said, really, an increase in opportunities, really, because I think that from somebody who graduates, I think quite a bit more time ago than I'd like to think now, you know, there wasn't many opportunities in areas of social justice law and social welfare law within Wales. You know, there's just, so it's, you know, what way do you go? I mean, most of the opportunities that and a lot of the experience I had was going to London, you know, and the only ability I had to do that was because my sister lives there, so I lived with her. So there's a lot of, you know, there's a lot of issues in terms of people who can't afford that. And if you're going to want people to stay in Wales, then you're going to have the opportunities for them to apply for them to want to stay, for them to you know, to have a you know, an emerging sort of sector, really. And something like the North Wales Law Centre would be, you know, great to add to, because if you don't have the places for them to apply, then a lot of them just go somewhere else.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've got another couple of questions.
Oh, yeah,
sorry.
That one. I was just going to add, networks like this are really important, because legal aid lawyers are gathered across Wales in very small groups often. So being part of a community is really important. But I think the really positive selling point is the policy and legislative framework in Wales, and the fact that the distance between providers and decision makers is so much shorter. So, you know, if you establish yourself as a legal aid lawyer, you know, you are likely to be part of stakeholder groups contributing to the development of policy. You know, there are great opportunities to influence here that you just don't have in England. So in terms of, you know, job satisfaction, yeah, I think it's a good place to be a legal aid lawyer.
Absolutely, and that also comes down to showcasing best practice and achievements of firms that have, you know, practiced here in Wales. And I know certainly, again, there was a recording on Legal News when we first launched, and if you go back through our features, it's actually an event that the Equality Commission ran, and it showcased a broad range of different lawyers and talking about their experiences, what they do in Wales, the kind of cases they work on, you know, what kind of outcomes they have, and the challenges at what level. So just really inspiring stuff. And I think, you know, that channeling through networks like this, hitting the right people to tell them that there is the work out there. Yes, it's probably an area that you have to be quite committed to and creative and very ambitious within it to try and build and drive a practice. But actually, if there are gaps in the market, to be able to do that, then can help, you know, and work with people like the Commission to help that grow, you know, then it can only be a good thing. Just slightly on that theme, I suppose, somebody's asked, I wonder what are the lawyers who used to work at Welsh legal aid firms that have recently closed now doing? Are they in private practice? Have they left the law? Have they moved to England? Does anybody know? I suspect any of all of those could apply. Thanks, Sian.
I spent quite a lot of my practice career working in Wales. As it happens, I'm still sat in Wales, just outside Merthyr Tydfil. And although my office is in Bristol, I still keep a caseload or chunks of my caseload in Wales because of my particular specialism. I moved to the position in Bristol because it's a funded position that allows me to have a specialism in children's immigration, which is incredibly rare. It's not just rare in Wales, it's rare in the UK. So I'm the only one for quite some miles. But what we've noticed is that I have clients in Wales still. So some of that have in some ways never left. It's worth, I'd just like to add that I didn't actually start probably my training in immigration in a legal aid firm. I started it with Asylum Justice. And the work that charity, and it's for its impact, it's an incredibly small charity which punches so far above its weight it's not even true. And would really like to point them out as a shining example of what can be done even without legal aid. So that's where I started, was Asylum Justice, and kind of still consider myself to be part of the gang, if I might. But yeah, that's where I am. I've only made it to Bristol, and I haven't even made it out of Merthyr.
Fantastic, thank you. There is a comment as well about opportunities for training contracts being very tight. I think that's true across the board. I know a lot's changing in terms of qualification now and ongoing, and how can they be expanded to accommodate the volume of graduates from Welsh universities, I think is a very broad issue covering every single practice, not just in Wales but across England as well. And I definitely think there's further event in another sphere about that. But yes, you're absolutely right. It's a conversation that should be had as well. Has anyone else got any questions before I kind of go back to my list? I'm conscious of time as well, Crash, but you're happy for me to ask another couple?
Yeah, I think we've certainly got another 10 minutes.
Fantastic, thank you. I've got one that perhaps I think if JJ might be the right person to answer this. So the question is, how will the Renting Homes Wales Act 2016 affect the provision of housing advice when it comes into force? Will it further erode capacity?
Yes. Yes, I mean, at Shelter, it's so far reaching in terms of changing most of tenancy law, that it's a significant change in housing advice and the knowledge advisors will need, and the knowledge, for example, we provide on our website. So there's an enormous intensive period, and we've actually had a sort of post standing by to respond to some of that online need for understanding and information for some time, as the implementation has sort of moved on into the distance, because it's various reasons have delayed it. But yes, it's a radical change, and I think it's probably cements the paths moving in their separate directions as a consequence of devolution. You know, we initially had small changes in statutory instruments in Wales. We then had the first measure around homelessness and a new approach to homelessness, and now we've got the whole, you know, bag and caboodle. We've got all the tenancies as well. So you really have got such a different set of legislation around housing in Wales. And it poses challenges for England and Wales providers, some of the sort of helplines and things, how they keep abreast of two different areas of evolving law.
Well, they're struggling to keep abreast of different social distancing measures, let alone areas of law. But yeah, no, I absolutely hear you. One of the things that, so I sit on Cardiff and District Law Society. I've got a number of different roles because I like to fill what little time I have left with no sleep. And, you know, you hear both sides of the argument and I get them both. So one of the conversations that many lawyers have when talking about legal aid and pro bono and legal advice clinics is, what kind of, when we're facing problems with access to justice due to legal aid cuts, could or should pro bono ever fill the gap? So for those in private, obviously in practice, you know, we know that there's a gap that needs to be filled, but obviously the more that gap is filled by pro bono, perhaps the less need there is, I suppose, from higher powers higher than us for legal aid funding. What do people feel, whether it's a one-liner or a bit of a longer answer for those on the panel? Thank you.
Is that all right to speak at all? So I haven't spoken before, but actually I feel quite passionate about this. My background is music, and in the music industry, it's rampant where it is expected. When you give something for free, people then expect it for free and constantly for free. And what's happened now in the arts industry is that a musician can barely get any work. The only way, say like musicians, and COVID has highlighted this, artists cannot get anything. It always has to be funded. I tried running a festival and we could not make it self-sustaining because the area that we live in I live in Conwy in North Wales. It's just, they don't have the finance. And what worries me with pro bono and the way that lawyers are doing, it's going down the same route as music and the arts. And I think it's very, very dangerous. I don't know if anyone else agrees with me, but it does concern me because I don't think it's sustainable. It will just erode. And we've got to the stage now that I'm changing from being a musician because there is no work for us.
Yeah, that's a really valid point, and it's really useful to cross compare with other sectors as well. Has anybody got a bit of feedback or some?
I just wanted to add a point on it, if it's okay. I mean, you know, for those of us who've worked in law and legal aid for our careers, we've spent many years honing those talents and skills, which are very different to, say, commercial lawyers, and what they do is very different. And speaking as someone who's been a social welfare lawyer for 13 years, I couldn't go out and be a commercial lawyer tomorrow, you know, and I always think to myself, it's got its own skill set and its own specialism, and I don't think they're comparing like with like at all. Our specialism and our way of thinking and our way of interacting with clients is something that is a dedicated specialism. It's not something to just have a go at occasionally.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
I noticed earlier on, not putting him on the spot, but we had David White here from Law Works Cymru, whose brief is to support the development of pro bono in Wales. So he might have a comment to make. But and I've sort of sat on their stakeholder sort of group, and I came to that with those same concerns. You know, is this a substitute for dedicated services? But the way they're set up and the way they set out their aims and objectives, they're really, really clear that this is absolutely no subject. This is no substitute for publicly funded advice. You know, it complements, gives people staff development opportunities. And I think, you know, Ruth's word of caution is probably entirely right, that we don't want to have such reliance. But as an addition, and the place we are in, you know, there is some additional voluntary help there that can be a great contribution, even if it's in effect an initial triage, you know, for first 20 minutes, first half an hour before referring on to a specialist.
Yeah.
Can I just come in there, because I think what JJ's raised is actually really important. But it's actually, for me, there's a real importance in us being clear about the difference between free and free to the client. So free at the point of delivery and somebody offering their time for free are two different things, and we mustn't let the outside world get those, you know, mixed up. And I think that the opportunities certainly that I've seen with pro bono work have led people into, you know, into the delivery of social welfare law, which I think is not a bad thing. But one of the things I put in the chat was about us needing some need analysis. Somebody said, we know how much need there is. Well, we do, but we're never going to persuade the policy makers of those who might actually be able to change legal aid law without doing some really good work about what need that is there that is unmet. And I think that's something we're certainly in the National Advice Network pushing Welsh Government to update their needs analysis across social welfare law, because we need to provide the evidence. We all know it's there. You know, we're all convinced, but the funders aren't.
That's such a good point, Fran. Thank you. Angharad, would you want to say something?
I'll just come in really briefly. I think I can agree with a lot of the comments that have been made. I think, except, you know, Ruth's point about particularly in the arts and free work, but there's always been a place, I think, for pro bono work, particularly for development opportunities and those sorts of things. But one of the things we've seen recently with our legal funding requests is obviously with pro bono work, if there's cost risks involved, we've sometimes been asked to fund sort of cost risks indemnify on those bases. So there can be sort of extra complications sometimes, exactly what, you know, Fran was talking about there about, you know, free at the point of delivery or completely free work. So there are sort of additional complications to consider, and we would certainly be pushing the same points, that it should only ever be sort of complementary, even though there is a place for pro bono work. There should be properly funded legal advice across Wales.
And it's a case of networking everybody together effectively then, isn't it? Absolutely. Sue?
Yeah, I just thought we do use pro bono in my law centre to build capacity, and it's really worked with a city firm who were doing representation on ESA tribunals, and we were training them and they were then delivering that, so that worked really well. We also do a form filling clinic with BPP law students, so that also kind of builds capacity. And I think as a bit of a plug for LawWorks, when I was setting up Ealing Law Centre, through LawWorks, we had a fantastic city lawyer who did the lease and stuff for us. So I think there is a place for it. It doesn't replace social welfare. And I think that there is a particular skill set, and the way that we approach our work is very different from private practice as well. You know, as legal aid lawyers and as social justice lawyers, because, you know, we try to treat the whole person and do it holistically, and we use grant funding as well to be able to deliver the other things that are no longer in scope. And so it really is a different way of looking at it. But I do think, you know, in our present situation, it can build capacity. And certainly in COVID, we had a massive need for employment advice, and we didn't have an employment advisor. And Garden Court Chambers have stepped in, and now we're taking the inquiries, and they are on a rota basis providing advice for people and building that capacity. So that's worked really well. So that's not replacing, because it just isn't there at all, you know, and that's the problem.
Thank you. I think have we got time? No, I think we're probably on for the poem at the end. Do you think of one more quick? I've got one quick question.
Depends how great you think the question is. If you think
wow. There's loads of chat going on, so which is great, because that's engagement. So I'm not going to pick those out, and I am recording the chat as well, so I can share that with YLAL to make sure that any introductions can be made.
Yeah, that can go out, can't it?
I think a really good one, just to get a quick soundbite from everybody that can on the panel, is: do you have any words or a word of advice for students in the audience or anyone else in the audience who's considering a career in legal aid? So that could be an attribute or something to consider. Would anyone like to have the first shot at that?
I'll go if you want. I'm not a legal aid lawyer, so I feel a little bit at a disadvantage. But certainly I've had different roles in the public sector, and my current role at the Equality and Human Rights Commission, it feels good to go to work and feel like you're making a difference a day. It may be that it feels difficult and that you're highlighting a lot of difficulties a lot of the time and challenges, but it also does feel good to be making a difference. And I think particularly at the current time, I've been impressed at how we can try and make a difference to people's lives. And that's what I see legal aid lawyers doing. So that's what I sort of bear in mind. You may earn a lot of money as a commercial lawyer, but you may end up not enjoying it at the end of each day.
Yeah, that's the perfect soundbite. Thank you. Anybody else, any wise tips or lessons?
I would say do it. Incredibly rewarding, and I've been doing it for 30 years, so.
Excellent, thank you.
So I would say, because I'm switching career, and so I've only got limited legal experience at this moment, is just grab every opportunity you can to get experience. I've just signed up to do one evening a week on a domestic violence helpline. So it's just, you know, grab any opportunity you can to sort of experience all the many different problems that exist in the legal world that legal aid lawyers can help with.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'd just like to echo those points. Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, if you want, I mean, I'm also at the moment working outside of legal aid, but I think that it's not just rewarding, but it's also the issues that you face are so interesting, but also, you know, often so difficult to deal with. And I think that it really gives you a basis for understanding, to be honest, the world around you. Do you know what I mean? Like, and understanding, you know, what people go through and how you can help them. And to be honest, without people doing the work, then, you know, we're in a pretty dark time. So without people doing the work and really getting stuck in, then, you know, a lot of people would be left without any help. So I think just, you know, for that reason, I think get involved. But yeah, it's probably definitely not for the money, I'd say, but yeah.
Try a career in journalism. You're on the same page. Definitely about altruism there as well. Anybody else got any advice?
I'd just say, similar to Angharad, as tough as it gets, and you know it does get very tough, you know, quite often, you will always look back and think, you know, I spent those years doing something worthwhile. You know, I've spent 30 years and I still look back and think, yeah, it's time well spent.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. If no one else has any other points to offer to that last one, I shall hand back over to Crash to introduce Sean. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's getting to the point of the evening where we'll be introducing our poet for the night, Sean. Before we do, just a few announcements. So first to say some thank yous. Diolch y galon i'n siaradwyr. Thank you so much to our brilliant speakers, Angharad, JJ, Hussein, Annie, Sue, Ruth, everybody who's contributed tonight. Thank you to the members of the YLAL committee, especially Emma Trevett, who is coordinating YLAL Cymru. You'll have seen her in the chat box for putting this together. Thank you, Emma, and everyone at Legal News, because I can't imagine how we would have coped with the technology and with the Q&A without your hard work. And Legal News are doing such a good job to build legal networks in Wales, so I'd strongly recommend people checking them out. And all those behind the scenes who have advised and supported and promoted and translated at points different parts of tonight's evening. I've put the links in the chat again, just so you've got the website where you can join Young Legal Aid Lawyers as a member. And I've also put a link there to the campaign that's going on. We heard from JJ talking about the importance of the economic viability of practice in these areas. And one of the things that's been really concerning is the change to legal aid rules in asylum cases. Young Legal Aid Lawyers are doing some really great work trying to get this change reversed because it will cause such serious problems for access to justice for asylum seekers and access to representation. And so I'd encourage you to take a moment, look at the campaign action. They've got a template letter for your MP and the Minister. And if you've got a few minutes over the next few days to send that out. Now, we want tonight to be the seed from which a beautiful network can grow, and we've heard so much about the value of networking. And so if you have any ideas for future events in Wales, then I'd encourage you to get in touch with the team through the email address that's there, because we know the context is specific, the challenges are unique. Devolution opens up a whole host of campaigning opportunities that we really want to be taking advantage of, and we really want to create a kind of community from this event. So please do get in touch if you've got ideas for events or for campaigns. So now over to Sian for our poetry. Sian Pierce is from Bristol Law Centre. You heard her before, she specialises in immigration work for children. She'll be reading a poem from an anthology called Lockdown Lawyers, which is called I Want to Be a Lawyer, Ma'am. Now, Lockdown Lawyers is an anthology of poetry on how the COVID crisis has hit legal aid lawyers and the provision of advice and advocacy. There are over 50 contributions. You'll hear one tonight from barristers, solicitors, advisors, and some of their family members. Some of them are haikus, some of them are multi-page poems, and they talk about crime, mental health, the absence of courts, and how practitioners are coping with working from home, or perhaps rather not. It's been edited by Emma Trevett, who I introduced, one of the committee members, and John Whitfield, QC, and aims to mark what has been the most unusual and difficult at times, and show how, despite the decades of cuts, people are still surviving. It aims to raise a smile, and all the proceeds of the book are being donated to the Law Centre's network. So I encourage you to take a look, see if you want to get a copy for yourself. But now over to Sian to hear her poem. Sian, are you here?
I am sorry, I fell out there for a bit, but I am back. Thank you, diolch yn fawr. I want to be a lawyer, man. I want to be a lawyer, man. I'll be a lawyer, Dad. I'll make you proud. I'll drive you round. I'll take you both to town. You can tell the neighbours, ma'am, and the bowls team, Dad. Tell them all I worked so hard. Now I'm off to Cardiff bound. I won't forget my roots though, ma'am. I'll remember, promise, Dad. I'll speak for them that has no voice and make you both so proud. Don't come to the office, ma'am. Don't buy me dinner, Dad. The office damp, it breaks your heart. This isn't the dream you had. I've had offers plenty, ma'am, and I won't take them, Dad. Though the fees are cut, we won't give up. But sometimes that times is hard. There's children going hungry, ma'am, and I can help them, Dad. And not just me, there's more, you see, dotted through the land. Because legal aid I am now, ma'am, a law centre lawyer, Dad. The girl from Swansea town, now Bristol bound. I hope I made you proud.
Diolch yn fawr, Sian. That was amazing, and a really perfect way to end tonight's event. So thank you so much, and I'd definitely recommend people check out the anthology to see what else it has in store. Now, I think that calls for us to just bring proceedings to a close, but as we said, we'll be in touch. You'll be able to access a recorded version of tonight's presentation, and that'll include everything that's been going on in the chat. So if you've shared your contact details so people can get in touch with you, they should be able to access that then. But as we said before, if there's anything that we or that YLAL can do to help you connect with other people who attended this night, then reach out and we'll do what we can to put people in touch. Thank you very much, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.